Welcome to She Defined, the podcast for smart, savvy women who are in search of more. I'm your host, Sharon Green. Today, I am joined by Laura Morel. Laura is a functional diagnostic medicine practitioner and focuses on women's physiology, hormonal health, and preventative care. In her work, she combines the neuroscience of behaviour change, helping her clients to understand the brain's function in decision-making, conditioned behaviours, and self-sabotage in relation to eating disorders and general health. She's also a qualified personal trainer and nutritionist. She runs Her Collective, a program that helps women bridge the gap between their physical and mental health and their emotional well-being. Laura, welcome to She Defined.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
Such a pleasure to have you here. Before we dive in, I do want to let listeners know that we will be talking about eating disorders, binge eating, and other body image-related topics today. So if these topics are difficult for you, please take this as a trigger warning. Now, Laura, I thought it would be helpful to start by giving our audience an introduction to who you are, because you cover a lot of areas across women's health. So perhaps we can begin with your personal journey that led you to doing the work that you do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And just listening to the bio, it does sound so complicated. So let's just streamline it so I can explain exactly what I do. But how I got to where I am is I went through my own journey, which feels really unique, but I think it's just so universal that so many women go through such similar journeys, but it's just been so taboo. So essentially when I was about a teenager, 14, that's when I essentially got into modeling and then got into quite distorted eating. And unfortunately, that just led me to just an awful teenage years of just really low body image. And that's when I started my first diet. I mean, 13, 14, like I really should not have been dieting.
That's wild.
It's so wild. I remember at like 12 going to my grandparents' house and jumping on the scales, and I was never allowed to be over 50 kilos. So I was like 47. I was like, yes. And that's kind of where it started. So I remember the exact moment. So to fast forward the story, I kind of got more into an industry which was very superficial, and they're not really afraid to sugarcoat if you don't look the part, and then ended up doing bikini modeling, which again is probably the most subjective sport. And now that I look back, I'm like, oh, little Laura, why do we do that? And for anyone who doesn't know what it is, essentially you get your body to be super lean, put bikinis on, heels, and you're basically in a pageant. So throughout that journey, I signed up to so many coaches, coach after coach, and essentially it led me to losing a lot of weight, losing my period, but then also developing binge eating. And on top of that, orthorexia. And orthorexia, for anyone that doesn't know, is when you only eat everything that's clean and healthy and organic and you don't touch anything. So it was drifting between orthorexia and then binge eating, and it was like blowouts and then restricting and losing all weight. And that was kind of my journey up until about 22. And that's all I knew. And I felt so alone. And I was like paying coach after coach, which was just solidifying more of my eating disorder. And I just felt like I couldn't really find anyone that could help me. And that's kind of when I started to learn and research on my own. And I did become a qualified PT, and that was kind of the starting block. So that's in short, in the nutshell, a little bit about my journey. So it's definitely a mix of developing things like PCOS and hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is losing my period, on top of having thyroid condition like hypothyroidism because I had dieted so much, and on top of that, the eating disorders of binge eating and orthorexia. So it was a pretty tough number of years, and it's just why I'm so passionate about what I do now.
Was there a moment that you hit where you're like, I've just got to stop this extreme dieting, then binge eating? It sounds like an absolute seesaw, and must have been an absolute range of emotions as well that you were going through. I mean, did you hit a point where you're like, I just can't do this anymore?
Yeah. I remember the exact moment. It was my last binge, and I was upstairs at my parents' house, and I was on the couch, and I don't know if you know the Coles triple choc cookies. That was my binge food. That was my kryptonite. And so I remember I used to have like one pack, and then that didn't satisfy the binge anymore. My brain was seeking more dopamine after that. So I went to Coles and I bought another pack, and there's like 6 cookies in that. And this was after like all my other binge foods too. And then it was at that moment, got home, was finishing the last cookie in the second pack, and I was like sick, physically sick. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like the thought of waking up tomorrow, knowing how I was going to feel, I was like, it needs to end. And that was literally the moment I was like, I'm finding a way out of this. So, I mean, I guess I can thank the triple choc cookies because once my kryptonite then was like my rock bottom that made me change. But that was the exact moment because it's just the change in emotions that you have. Like you said, that roller coaster of when you're losing weight and you're small, you're so happy and confident. And then the blowout happens and you're in depression and you say no to social events and you have this chronic anxiety, and it's just an awful world where you're just waiting for that doomsday of a blowout.
Yeah. And all through this, you noticed that there was also a gap in the health and fitness industry where personal trainers lacked the expertise in mindset, eating disorders and hormonal health, where psychologists lacked the link of nutrition and movement, and even naturopaths and dietitians didn't grasp the nuances of distorted eating behaviours. So how are you bridging these gaps now in the work that you do?
Yeah, this was a big thing that as I started in my career as a personal trainer, and I'm really honest about my personal training qualifications, they taught me nothing about women's physiology. They taught me nothing about distorted eating. And essentially all I learned was, yes, the beautiful movement side, which I love, biomechanics. But what it lacked was the women that was showing up as my clients, they struggled with distorted eating patterns, with body image issues. And we just didn't have the knowledge with the little PT qualification that I had. It didn't cover that. So unfortunately, the industry isn't regulated and we are paying coaches who are essentially trying to help us with body image and trying to help us with distorted eating, but they don't have that scope. And, you know, that's when I needed to seek help from a psychologist. And I love talkative therapy. Amy, my psychologist, I absolutely love her. But what we also found, like before I'd met her throughout my journey with psychologists, talkative therapy is amazing to help shift perceptions and get to the root cause of things. However, there isn't that knowledge in nutrition. And so then you also need to find a qualified nutritionist or dietitian, but again, they don't have the gap or the knowledge in, you know, distorted eating patterns and why we keep self-sabotaging. And that's the pattern that I saw with my clients. I'm like, I ended up getting qualified because I studied advanced physiology for women and advanced nutrition for specific distorted eating and hormonal conditions. And I just studied and studied and studied, and I learned and understood everything about the body as much as I could. And then I was like, great, I have all this knowledge to help my clients, but then they'd fall off track. And I'm like, why? They kept sabotaging. And it's like, here's the knowledge. And that's where I realized there's a big gap. One, the industry isn't regulated. So a lot of women sign up to PTs or, you know, anyone for a deficit. But because it's not regulated, we're putting people in deficits who have distorted eating patterns or might have hormonal conditions they're not aware of. And that's where it becomes really quite dangerous for women because we're now paying to cement even worse eating patterns. And that creates all these limiting beliefs and conditioned behaviours. And essentially that's what happened to me. And I always say I paid for my eating disorder because unfortunately it's not regulated. I wanted to lose weight, but I definitely was not ready or in a position to be in a deficit or lose weight. And it's so multifaceted as well. It's not just about calories in, calories out. So what we do now is we basically bridge it all together. We teach you how to eat for your body. So it's not just here's a meal plan that, you know, every other of my other clients that we pigeonhole into categories gets. It's we teach you how to eat for you, but also your lifestyle. Because I know like you and I, our lifestyles are probably very different.
Yeah.
Or, you know, my bestie Felicia, who's a mum of 2. So her lifestyle is going to be different. So you learn to eat, but the other thing is you learn to build out meals and how to actually eat for your body. Because if I was to ask women out there, when was the last time or when did you learn to eat? It's probably when you started a diet. We don't actually learn anything about how do we actually fuel ourselves? How do we actually build out meals? How much protein should we be getting a day? The only time and again, not to generalize, but a lot of the time, the only knowledge we have is because we started investigating ourselves to lose weight. So there's a big gap between health and then diet culture. So one, it's not regulated, the industry. So people are going into deficits that really shouldn't be. And two, there's a big difference between diet and health, and we give them the knowledge of how to actually be healthy and not just diet. And three, probably one of the biggest things we do in our business now is teach about the brain. The brain is the organ that helps you with behavior change. And so we have this beautiful synergy of the soft science and hard science, as I like to call it. The soft science is your thoughts, it's your perceptions, it's how you see the world. That's ultimately what makes you make decisions. And then there's the harder science, and that's learning about brain health. That's learning about parts of the brain and how to optimize parts of the brain that control behavior change, like the prefrontal cortex and, the amygdala and all these beautiful parts of the body. And so we bridge all those things together. You learn how to eat for you, for your body. You learn how to move for your body and your lifestyle. And then you actually learn how to optimize your brain health so you can actually overcome a lot of distorted eating patterns, change your thoughts and perceptions. And that in turn then helps overcome self-sabotage.
I want to talk about binge eating now specifically. How would you define binge eating? And by that I mean, how would you identify someone who is a binge eater compared to someone who might overindulge occasionally?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I think a big issue in society is we tend to identify ourselves as, I'm a binge eater, and we categorize. And that's how the brain works. We love to categorize and we love to identify. So the difference is with binge eating, there's different think of it like on a scale or a degree of binge eating. And there's a difference between binge eating and simply overeating as well. So binge eating is where it's out of control. It's like a blackout experience. And then you're like, oh my God, I don't even remember eating all of that. It's an out of body experience, and it's always followed by guilt and shame and a lot of those negative emotions as well. So that's binge eating. And you would want to be classified or to be categorized as someone who's a binge eater. You do need to have multiple episodes as well. So it's not just the occasional, oh, I overate. It's quite consistent. Overeating or overindulging, that's quite different. This is where you are in control and you are aware that you're overeating. Like, for example, I came home from America on Saturday and I was quite full. We went out for brunch, and of course my mum made the best carrot cake. And if anyone knows, I'm obsessed with my mum's carrot cake. So I definitely had a little bit too much. That is me proactively overeating and consciously aware. So that's very different. So understanding the difference between the two is so important for women, because overeating could be simply a byproduct of not having enough protein throughout the day, not having enough calories throughout the day, distorted eating patterns like scarcity mindset. Are we telling ourselves, I can't have this tomorrow, so I need to eat all of it today? Whereas binge eating is much more where we require a little bit more of the psychological help, medical professionals, because it is quite exacerbating. It's quite exhausting. And it's, like I said, it's kind of that blackout experience.
And what are some of the typical behaviours you see in women who binge eat? Like, are there clear signs?
Yeah, there definitely is clear signs. In most cases that I see, under eating is probably one of the biggest causes, and emotional or inability to regulate emotions is probably the secondary to that as well. Third, I would say, is just lack of knowledge in nutrition, but I would probably focus on the first two. So the first one, which is under eating, and it might not just be in calories, it can also be in nutrients as well. So this is why it's not just about if it fits your calories, because you could be eating 2,000 calories, but if you're not getting enough amino acids and protein, if you're not getting enough complex carbs, your body's going to scream, and you'll have gentle like taps. It'll be like, hey girl, like just a little bit hungry, and it will send you these beautiful small signals, but we've ignored it because we can't eat, have to wait. And then it's going to scream louder and louder, and the cravings are like your mental real estate is just fighting cravings all day long. So what happens is, unfortunately, we're so disconnected from our bodies, because for so long, as we spoke about earlier, we're being told what to do with our food. We're being told what to eat, when to eat. So we don't actually know when we're hungry. We actually don't know how to listen to that beautiful little, hey girl, we're hungry. Like tummy's a little bit empty and energy's a little bit low, until we're ravenous. So when it comes to binge eating, it really is important to understand nutrition plays a huge role. So this is not just to get enough calories, but it's also to make sure we're getting the right amount of macronutrients and quality macronutrients too. With the emotional regulation issue, this is probably another really big thing I see. And again, we've just never learned how to regulate emotions. I come from, love my parents. My mum will emotionally eat and my dad would work. So guess what conditioned behaviors I have? I overwork and then I'm overeating whilst I'm overworking. So we don't know what we don't know. And we're a byproduct of what we've been brought up with. And even for example, I was in a supermarket a few months ago and there was this beautiful little child, probably 3 or 4, and it was having a little tantrum. And no judgment to the mum, I'd probably do the same. But the mum was like, oh, I'll buy you a chocolate bar if you just stop crying. And again, I'm not a mum, but if I had a crying baby, 3-year-old, I'd probably do the same. But that's just an example of how we've been taught to just suppress emotions or turn them off or go to food to switch off those emotions. And we've just never actually learned how to feel emotions, and emotions pass. So it is important to learn how to feel and learn how to process, because then what happens is our nervous system gets quite heightened and it seeks serotonin, but it's not going to go, hey girl, we need serotonin. It's going to go chocolate, chips, cookies, because it's the carbohydrates in that gives us dopamine. But again, the brain's not going to be like, girl, we need dopamine. It's going to be like chocolate, chips, cookies. So again, that's why understanding how to regulate emotions and knowing how to interpret what our body is saying is so important. So they're the 2 main things I see with binge eating.
And you focus a lot on mindset and psychology in the work that you do. How does this aspect play out in relation to binge eating?
Yeah. This is a really interesting one. And I like to teach the concept of a cognitive triad, which is a mechanism that our brain kind of goes through, because our thought generates feelings, and then those feelings generate our actions. And that's kind of the main principle of how we go from thought to action. But a lot of the time we run on 95% autopilot. So we lack a lot of mindfulness, and there's a big misconception of what meditation and mindfulness is in the world, because let me tell you, it's not just sitting there and trying to think nothing, because that's going to be almost impossible for 99% of the population. Credit to you if you can do it. But mindfulness comes in because it's just being able to be present and aware of your thoughts before it goes to action stage. So you're not reacting to your thoughts, but you're observing it. Kind of like, when you're a child and you're lying on the ground and you see clouds pass, you're not doing anything about it. You're just witnessing the clouds and then they pass. That is what mindset is. So what happens is with the cognitive triad, it's the psychology comes into a big play, because when you have certain thoughts, which are usually habitual, whether that's about yourself, and a lot of the time, because we have negativity bias in the brain, it's generally going to be negative about ourselves. And I always say to women, up here in my brain, it is like puppy dogs and lollipops 90% of the time. And it's great. Don't get me wrong, 10% of the time I'm like, oh, holy crap, what am I going to do? And then there's that stress, but I know how to control it. But for a lot of women, because we've never really learned how to process emotions or deal with stress, it's a very negativity bias. And it's kind of like a bully following us around 24/7. You're fat, you're bloated, you're this, you're that, you can't eat this. So those thoughts are then generating feelings of like unworthiness, I'm not good enough. And then that leads to the action, which is probably I need to comfort myself with food. I'm not going to go to gym because there's a fear of embarrassment. So we procrastinate, we overeat, we binge eat. And these are all what we call the sabotaging behaviours. So that's essentially, and there's much more to it in terms of the psychology, because there's a lot of things around like limiting beliefs, which are beliefs that we've kind of told ourselves over the years that we really believe. And then we live by that, but they're not true. And so psychology is quite complex, but to simplify, that's how I like women to kind of start, just by understanding, are we aware of our thoughts, or are we just reacting to them? And how can we redefine what mindfulness is? And that's what mental strength is. It's your ability to be able to pay attention to thoughts. Otherwise, as I said, 95% autopilot, we're just kind of repeating, and then we're having the same actions, and like, how am I here again?
Yeah. And how do you work with women to overcome the cycle of binge eating? Can you share some examples of strategies you employ or things that you do to help women shift their perspective on binge eating?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have our own framework now, which is called the GLOW framework. And I think that's just cute because we all want to glow from the inside. So the GLOW framework is something that I've created over a decade now, which is absolutely crazy. But it identifies the gaps we spoke about when it comes to trying to end distorted eating and binge eating. And so the first thing we do is we do not give you calories and macros, which a lot of women are like, so where are my calories and macros? I'm like, oh, we're not there yet. So that's something where it's more of an advanced tool. First is just gentle nutrition. Let's just learn how to eat, because nutrition's the backbone to mental health, to all your health issues, and to overcoming binge eating. And that's why the business is called Her Collective. The Her stands for Healthy Eating Revolution. So it's learning how to eat, build out meals, learning how to eat out, because trust me, eating out is normal. I can't remember the last time I did not eat out. So we want to normalize eating out, but we want to learn how to eat out. So gentle nutrition is the first thing that we do. And throughout that gentle nutrition of building out meals, that's where we start working out where all the limiting beliefs come in, where the diet culture rules come in. So when I'm looking at the girls' nutrition, I can generally see a lot of food fears. They're not adding carbohydrates, then I probe around that. So having that gentle nutrition brings out pretty much all the diet culture from under the surface that's literally driving our behaviors around food. And you'll be surprised how powerful the mind is, because the mind can go, I don't like protein. But actually, we've just been told protein makes you fat. I actually don't like carbs. I'm like, girl, you don't like carbs? How? But we've been told carbs are bad, it makes me fat. So we've actually believed we don't like carbs. So we work through all of that. Then it's about identifying the triggers. And these are really important. I want the triggers to come out. We want them to come out, because that's where we're identifying where is it throughout our life or throughout the week where we're not having mindfulness, we're not present, maybe we're not even just simply organized, and we're just going for easy friction food. So that's when we kind of work out, is it because of Friday, it's end of the week, long week, and that's where we kind of fall apart? Is it when you have a really stressful day? Is stress the trigger? So then it's about learning the triggers of what causes us to go for the overeating, binge eating. And then it's actually establishing, okay, well, let's work out, is it binge eating? Or is it distorted eating? Or is it simply overeating? Because like I said at the start, a lot of women have identified themselves as a binge eater, but then when we actually review what their binge looks like, it's not actually a binge. It's just overeating because their body's screaming for energy. So it is very case specific for clients, but the framework is a framework that a lot of women can start pretty much and do it in a self-guided way, where they're just teaching themselves to learn how to eat, build out meals, learn where their triggers are. And then we do a lot of the psychology, which is understanding where are their limiting beliefs, what are the rules that they're telling themselves, and learning how to, and this is my favorite part of it, learning how to debate between, you've got a monkey mind and a human mind, which I know sounds a little bit wacky, but the monkey mind is just our part of the brain that is called the amygdala, and that's basically puts us into stress response. So imagine a monkey in your brain, and it lives in a mountain called the amygdala. And when we're stressed, which for most women is a lot of the time, that monkey's in control, but that runs off conditioned behaviors. It's full of self-sabotage. It's your negative thoughts about yourself. The opposite to that is your prefrontal cortex. And I always say it's my favorite body part. It's your frontal part of the brain. And this is where decision-making happens. This is where emotional regulation happens. This is our human mind. And this is where animals don't have a prefrontal cortex. So they can eat and they don't have any emotions attached to it. We're much more complex creatures. And when one is up, the other is down. So when one is overactive, the other is going to be underactive. So usually the monkey mind, the amygdala, the stress state is overactive. So that means the prefrontal cortex is underactive. That means our decision-making is compromised. Our impulse control is compromised. Our emotional regulation is compromised. And that's where behavior change happens. So then it's about learning about how to control that.
I want to talk about orthorexia and body image now. You mentioned earlier that you've struggled with orthorexia, and just as a reminder, that's when someone has an obsession with only eating healthy food. What would this look like in a day-to-day scenario?
Yeah, orthorexia, and it's funny because it's such a contrast to binge eating, and that's how complicated and complex the brain is. So day to day, what this would look like, and I remember, and I don't have many regrets, but one of the biggest regrets I have is I used to pack my own dinners, which was like chicken and rice in a container, and I'd bring it with me to my grandparents' house when they had this beautiful Szechuan dinner, which is all healthy. It's like rice and fish and like beautiful carrot dishes. And orthorexia is like, oh, even if they had chicken, I don't know if that chicken's organic. I can't eat it. I don't know what type of rice it is. It's not organic. I can't eat it. You go to a cafe or restaurant, I don't know what oils they're using. I can't eat it. And you only eat food that you know is completely organic. But on the flip side, it's like when you then go into a binge moment, all those rules disappear because you're eating the chips and chocolates and cookies. And it's just so exhausting for the brain to be so extreme in one and then complete extreme in the other. And so orthorexia creates this internal stress because there's so much stress of food you can't have, you can't eat. I don't know what's in it. And you're just constantly overanalyzing. So yeah, when you're suffering orthorexia in combination with binge eating, it's just fighting these extremes in your brain, and it's just exhausting.
Yeah, it sounds like this sort of compulsive control. So how do we know when that obsession with eating healthy food becomes harmful? You know, when is it merely just eating a well-balanced meal versus obsessing over everything we're eating and how we're preparing it and so on?
And this is something I'm so passionate about as well, because I think back to when I had orthorexia, and I probably did push my orthorexia onto early clients back then because I believed you can't eat anything that has, inflammatory foods in it. You can't have anything that has gluten in it. And I was like so 100%. And now that I look back, in terms of like when it becomes more stressful, I believe in moderation now because I have the best lifestyle where it's like I can go out for dinner and not care what oils I use. I can go out and indulge in a piece of cake. And there's just no guilt or shame. And unfortunately, we live in a world of very dichotomy mindsets, and society, social media loves extremes, loves black, loves white. Eat this and you're going to die. You can't eat this because it's clickbait too. And so we're living in a world where everything is extremes. And so unfortunately, we look on social media for advice and help. And all we see is like one extreme to another. And the way I define when have we passed that line is how stressful is your life? Is it really stressful to choose food? Do you say no to events because of the food? Are you able to go out and go for a brunch with your girlfriends? Or if your partner surprises you on a date night, can you go out on a date night, or is that just extremely stressful for you? So I think we know when we've kind of hit the unhealthy side of everything has to be healthy, when it starts creating internal stress, it starts affecting your lifestyle choices, and it starts affecting the connections with people you love around you because you don't want to go out. You don't want to eat any food that anyone's cooked for you. And it just becomes so stressful.
Yeah, and debilitating.
That's so debilitating.
Yeah. So would you say that a lot of distorted eating is rooted in mental illness? And are there aspects of psychology that need to be employed when you help people tackle an eating disorder?
Absolutely. So this is where, as a practitioner, it's really important for me to know, is this just distorted eating from your typical don't know how to eat, diet culture, low self-esteem, and that's what we can really address. If it is more the clinical, that's where we definitely have to work with clinical psychologists to help as well. So it's about being aware of the difference between a mental illness and, for example, distorted eating. A mental illness, you really do need to have clinical help. You do need to have a psychologist on your team. Whereas distorted eating isn't so much a mental illness, but I would say it's categorized as kind of poor mental health. And a lot of that is just optimizing your brain health through a lot of natural ways, like learning how to eat, get out in sunlight, move your body, do mindfulness. And as I said, mindfulness doesn't have to be 20-minute meditation. It can simply be like, for example, I'll give you a funny example. I don't know if you'd call this manipulation, but with like for my partner, for example, if I try to encourage him to do mindfulness and he's like really against it, I'll be like, let's just play I Spy. And so we'll go outside and I'll be like, I spy in my little eye something that's blue. And he has to sit there and find all the blue things. That is mindfulness. You're completely just focused on the present moment. So again, is that manipulation? I don't know, but it has a good agenda. So just doing things like mindfulness can really improve your brain health, and that's so important. So again, when it comes to mental illness, for as a practitioner, you have to really see, is this deeper rooted where there is, chemical imbalances in the brain and there's deep rooted trauma, and that is where you definitely need to kind of explore more clinical practices. Whereas a lot of the time, it's more of distorted eating patterns and the focus can be within your control. It's just learning how to improve your brain health through those aspects that I spoke about.
Why do you think so many women struggle with body image or body dysmorphia?
This is a great question. And again, I feel like I say this to every question, something I'm really passionate about. Body image is a really interesting one. And I personally actually don't use the word body image, which is very different for a lot of practitioners to hear because we see body image everywhere. And one thing I always like to explain, there's a difference between body image and body perception. An image is an image. That's like raw data. Perception is the story we tell ourselves. And bear with me here, but I don't know if you know the episode on Friends where Joey memorizes the cue cards for the dinosaur museum to impress this girl. And anyway, he walks the complete wrong way. So he's like reciting all this education about the wrong thing. That's kind of what body image versus body perception is. Your perception is the story you're telling yourself, regardless of what image is there. He was pointing at the complete wrong dinosaur and just telling a story. And that's essentially what body perception is for women. And what I like to encourage is if anyone's listening, think back to 10 years ago and look back at your body. And maybe you were leaner and you're like, oh my God, why didn't I appreciate my body back then? I was so lean. And then it's 10 years later, we say the same thing. And then 10 years in the future, you're probably going to say the same thing about where you are now. Why didn't I just appreciate my body? The perception, the story has never changed of what we've told ourselves. So body image is the image, but body perception is the story attached to that image. And that's why for a lot of women, even if we lose the weight, we still have the same story. So we're not happy, but you've lost the weight. So what's really important here is to understand that image is like the raw data and perception is the stories we tell ourselves. Like, for example, I feel like maybe you can zoom in to see if you can see my crooked chin. My whole life, I have had a crooked chin. And no one has ever told me this. But in every single photo, because of the negativity bias in my brain, the first thing I always look at is my crooked chin. And that's because that's the story I've told myself. I have a crooked chin. Are you trying to look at my chin now? I'd be like,
no, I've never noticed it.
Yeah, exactly. It's just crazy the stories we tell ourselves. But the other thing as well, I like to teach about body image versus perception is think about a bully earlier on in your life or an ex-partner who you hate now. Love them right now or tomorrow. Say an affirmation and love them. This is unfortunately where the industry is at the moment. It's, again, a black and white world of we've gone from body hate and now you have a coach and society telling us we need body positivity and body love. And that does not happen. You can't just go from hate and self-hate and self-loathing to then loving ourselves. And that sets us up for such failure because we're trying to love ourselves. We're trying to embrace our body because I'm supposed to love my body no matter what. But you can't go from those extremes. So one thing I really encourage to shift the perception and our story is learning the body neutrality scale. This means you might be on the 0, you might be even -0, which is just, I hate my body, can't stand it. Then you kind of go up to the 3, which is in the middle, and that's body respect. It's body neutrality. Can we just be neutral about our body? Can we just respect it enough to nourish it? Which would be like, you know what? I'm not in my forever body right now, but I love it enough, or I'm going to tolerate it enough, or respect it enough to know that I still need 3 meals in today, even if I feel bloated. Even if I feel fat, I still deserve to eat. That's body respect and body love. Then you make your way through the scale to body like, which is like, we don't really have major concerns. We're very neutral about it. And then you got body love, which is like, yeah, girl, I'm just fire. And one thing I like to say as well is it's fluid. You're not always going to be at number 5. Like, I'm very body confident, but trust me, there's days where I'm like, we're just going to put on a looser t-shirt today and just practice body neutrality. I'm just grateful I can go for a run today. You know what? The next day, it might go back up to 5. So that's how I kind of like to explain what body image is versus perception, and how to kind of remove the disappointment when we are trying to find that body love and have better body image.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk about hormonal health because you also have this kind of intertwining into all the work that you do. What do you want women to know about how hormones play into their overall health, especially within the context of when we're talking about diet, exercise, eating, all these things we've already been discussing?
Yeah, hormonal health. Again, another thing I'm really passionate about. I think the biggest thing I'd want women to understand is we have beautiful hormones and they do such great things for us, and they actually link into being able to maintain a lean physique. So we don't actually realize the importance of hormones, and hormones doesn't necessarily have to be just sex hormones. You've got hormones like hunger hormones, leptin and ghrelin, and these are your fullness and hunger hormones. So these are like your traffic light systems for your appetite. Green means go and red means stop. But we're so disconnected from these hormones because of undereating. So our sex hormones as well plays a really big role, because estrogen is just so important for serotonin, which is so important for emotional health. Then you got progesterone, which plays a big role in the thyroid. And unfortunately in society, we do have a big issue of not necessarily low progesterone or high estrogen, but in relation to one another. So this means we primarily have low progesterone, which then makes our estrogen slightly higher. And that creates a lot of issues. But when we have healthy hormones and we're able to listen to them, it's important to know that our nutrition can change slightly, because you're going to crave different foods. Your body's going to work better with certain foods at different types of your cycle. And fun fact for women out there, we should not just be eating, say, for example, a coach says you're on 1,800 calories every day. That's your calories. Due to our hormones, our energy demands change every single week, and there's 4 weeks to a cycle. So that's going to fluctuate for the 4 weeks. And especially when we're in week 3 post-ovulation, our metabolic rate increases by 1 to 3%. That means we need to be eating 100 to 300 calories higher. And that's usually when women are like, nope, I'm on 1,800, but their body needs more energy. And that's where we tend to see a lot of emotional eating, binge eating, overeating leading into our periods. So the most important thing I can say about hormones is really learn about the 4 stages of hormones if we have a natural cycle, understand the importance and the link between that and body composition, and then just being educated and empowered to kind of learn, how can I adjust my nutrition to optimize my hormones? For example, when I'm leading into ovulation, I've got higher estrogen. That's where I have my most carbs. I am a carb monster around that time. But then I know after ovulation, I generally crave more fats. And it's just this intuition that we've kind of ignored for so long because we're just being told what to do, told what to eat, carbs are bad. And fun fact, our brain runs on glucose, which is carbohydrates, and women actually run on carbohydrates. Men can run efficiently off fat. Women can't. So we actually need it, especially for the hypothalamus in the brain, which is like our hormonal HQ. It's the headquarters. This is where our sex hormones begin, in the brain. So if we have fertility issues, PMS issues, any cycle issues, instead of just looking at the ovaries or the hormone production, we need to look at the brain, because that's where it starts. And that hypothalamus, the headquarters, runs on carbohydrates.
Which leads me into my next question. You touched on like the different phases of the cycle. Should we be eating differently or even exercising differently at these different points? So, you know, for example, you've got like the luteal phase and the follicular phase and the ovulation and then menstruation. Like, should we really be, instead of employing this one size fits all approach and I'm just doing the same thing for each of those phases, is it helpful for us to really tune into that and go, hang on, I'm a little low on energy this week. Maybe I'm going to do some more gentle exercise. But then when I've got more energy later in the month, then I can do more of that kind of like HIIT or heavy weights or whatever. And likewise with eating, have those extra calories when the body is telling you that you need it. What are your thoughts around adjusting for each of those different phases?
Do it. In short, do it. Absolutely. Everything you said was spot on there, and I couldn't agree more. Again, unfortunately, and going back to my journey, I've had coaches in the past. One I had to call Papa. We won't even go there. And that's basically how I destroyed my hormones, because he basically took out carbohydrates from me. And basically, it doesn't matter where I was in my cycle, I had to hit PBs. I had to keep pushing. I had to do my cardio. So it is really important to understand our body fluctuates. Men run on a 24-hour cycle. They don't have too much fluctuations, maybe a dip here and there throughout the day. Women, we run on a monthly cycle. So you've got follicular phase and then you've got luteal phase. Follicular phase is day 1 of your bleed up until ovulation. And you can kind of split it into 2 phases, early follicular, late follicular. Early follicular, this is where you're on your bleed. And when you are on your bleed, your everything's kind of inflamed. Your womb's inflamed, and that's actually connected to the back. So this means when we're lifting heavy and deadlifting heavy, our back's already compromised. So we need to be careful, and your energy might be lower. Now, I don't believe in just textbook, this is how the body works. It's how does your body feel? For example, day 1 for me, I will never do heavy strength training. If I feel good, I'll go in with my body about 60%, 50% until I feel that strength come back. So in this particular phase, the follicular phase, as you come up to ovulation, because your estrogen's higher, that's where you're kind of in your flirty, confident, you actually feel so good. That's where you can probably push things a little bit more. You can train harder. As you're about to ovulate, go for your 1RM, go for the 3 rep max, because that's where you're going to be strongest, and you've got your hormones to protect, especially your back, because they're anti-inflammatory, progesterone and estrogen. This is also where you can increase your carbs, because estrogen has a relationship with insulin. And so that means we better utilize carbohydrates. Then we ovulate and we go into our luteal phase. Now, again, everyone's slightly different, but this is where we have better fat metabolism. So increasing your fat doesn't mean you take out the carbs. You keep them the same, but you can gently increase it. And keep in mind, this is where our metabolic rate's higher. So you will have a higher energy demand. So this is where we kind of want to increase our calories a little bit. This is where you can do more endurance stuff. Your body's working really well leading up to our period. And this is what I call the introvert time. This is where it's like, oh, I'm leading into my period. I really don't want to see anyone. And I'm really honest with my girlfriends too. Like, I'll say, I'm coming up to my period. Unless you want to come over, or I can come over to your house and I'll sit on the floor. This is what I do with my best friend, Haley. Great. But I really don't feel like going out to a place that's loud noises, because our bodies are designed to kind of more introvert during this time. And this is where we really want to be focusing on complex carbs, because our magnesium will be deficient. Our body's going through a little bit more stress. So really important to make sure we're having complex carbs, so we avoid the PMS carb monster mentality where we kind of just binge eat around that time.
Yeah. Now, just to start wrapping up, I've got a couple more questions. But when we're thinking about our health holistically, what's one thing that you think women misunderstand about their health that you would love them to know about?
Yeah, simplicity. We don't need all the pills. We don't need all the supplements. I think sometimes we're focusing on the top of the pyramid and we forget the bottom. And we live in an industry where, again, it's very dichotomous and it's very extremist, that you need to have these supplements. You need to be having, the powder of a virgin lion from African jungle. You need this powder. And it's like, no. Do you get outside in sunlight in the morning? How many of us actually go outside and sit in the sunlight without sunglasses just for 10 minutes? How many of us prioritize sleep versus how many of us just run on wearing it as a badge of honor? I only get 5 or 6 hours. We're in the hustle life. And that was me for so many years. So the biggest thing when it comes to holistic health is it's easy to fall into the trap of the extremes of what people preach. Like, another thing is just even filtered water. Just filtering our water can have the biggest impact. So I think it's just, don't forget the little things and build foundations of just learning how to eat, because there is no point in taking these fancy $90 supplements if we actually don't have enough consuming fats to actually help absorb the nutrients. So it's basically just going in your body and you're basically just pooping out that $90 capsule. So again, it's just, don't forget the basics, build the foundations, and you don't have to spend so much money to do it. It's just learning how to create a lifestyle that is just so holistic. And, my partner laughs at me because my favorite thing to do is in the morning, wake up, we'll go to gym, breakfast first, can't leave the house without eating, go to gym, have a coffee and sit in the sun like a reptile. I'm like, let's find the chair that has the sun so I can just sit there with my coffee. And that is one of the best things for mental health, to set your sleep up, and also sleep. Prioritize sleep. That's probably the next thing as well. It's probably the easiest low-hanging fruit that we can get that is the most missed.
And lastly, what's something small women can do today to end the cycle of unhelpful habits in relation to diet and exercise and everything else we've spoken about today? Like, what's one small step that they can take?
My favorite thing to tell women, you're not broken. Your brain's not broken. It's actually so efficiently wired. And so one small step is stop telling ourselves that we're broken, because our brain is just so efficiently wired in these conditioned behaviours that we've repeated for years. And so as soon as you have that hope to be like, I'm actually not broken, I've just been doing the same thing, and my brain, because your brain doesn't like to use energy. It likes efficiency, which means doing the same things over and over, even though they don't have a good outcome. So if anyone's listening to this and is resonating with a lot of the things, I just encourage you to just firstly tell yourself you're actually not broken. Majority of women go through their own story of similar stories, and everyone can rewire their brains. So one thing I always say to clients is, your brain's working perfectly fine. We just need to go in and do a little bit of a rewiring, a little bit more efficiency, so you can start doing behaviours that actually work towards you. So yeah, my first thing I'll tell women is, you're not broken.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all your knowledge. It's just, we could talk for hours more. There's so much to cover, but I think what we've touched on today will help a lot of women out there. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for letting me share. And hopefully there's some women out there that resonate and decide to feel brave enough that they can change.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of She Defined. If you found any of the topics discussed today distressing and you may need help, please contact the Butterfly Foundation. It's an Australian charity that supports people impacted by eating disorders and body dissatisfaction. You can call their helpline on 1800 33 4673 or visit their website at butterfly.org.au. If you found this episode helpful or insightful, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment and review. It really helps us out. I've been your host, Sharon Green, and if you'd like to know more about She Defined, you can visit our website at shedefined.com.au.